This is Mark in the Center for Online Learning and Innovation here with some tips for counting things in Google Sheets. You may be aware that Sheets, like any good spreadsheet application, can do all sorts of math calculations for you. A simple but often useful example is counting data in a set of cells or a range. For example, how many days last week did students walk into our office requesting information? How many days last week did students call our office? Can I quickly count certain kinds of data within a range, excluding blank cells or other kinds of data? Let's take a look. So in this first example, let's say I'm running a career development office for students. I've accrued some data on how often students request information from us about career opportunities. These are broken down by mode on the left. Students that walked into our office, students who called us on the telephone, or students who visited and filled out our Google form application on the web. Naturally, the super efficient web-based form gets the most business. I'll start by counting how many days each mode of communication received any student requests in this column here, column AF. I can use the count function for that. In Sheets, functions are formatted consistently. I start by entering an equal sign, and then I add the function name, count. In parentheses, I add cell references to the cells where there is data that, well, I want the count function to count. I add the close parentheses, and when I hit enter, or I just click outside the cell, the function goes to work. In this case, it tells me there were 17 days where at least one student walked into our office to request information. In the process, this function ignored the empty cells and did not count them. The count function will only work with numerical entries, so in the cell references, even if I included this cell here, the results are the same, because this function, being the count function, will ignore the text in cell A3. Notice that the function didn't tell me how many students walked into the office in November to request information. To find that out, I'd have to add these numbers together, and Google Sheets will do this easily too. In this case, I'll use the sum function. Equals sum, parentheses, cell references, close parentheses, 38 students walked into our office to request information in the month of November. As is always the case in Sheets, I can click the little square in the lower right-hand corner of a cell with a function, and I can drag it down for that function to be copied into the cells below it. However, the cell references in each function are adjusted to match the row in which the function is located. So very quickly, I'm told that on 21 days, at least one student called us on the telephone to request information, and on 27 days, a student requested information via our Google form. To find out how many days nobody requested information by a particular mode of communication, I could do the math in my head, create a spreadsheet formula that subtracts this value from the number of days in the month of November, or I could just use a function that simply counts the blank spaces. Google Sheets has one of those. Here I simply use the COUNTBLANK function. Pretty straightforward. For this sheet, let's say I'm working with data on volunteers at an animal shelter. Say I'd like to know how many shifts volunteers worked at the shelter on these dates in the column headers. Then, I'd like to know how many shifts each volunteer worked on those set of dates. I can use the COUNTA or COUNTALL function to get a quick total here, and then I could use the COUNTIF function in each of these cells to find out how many shifts each volunteer worked. To get the total number of volunteer shifts, I enter the COUNTA function. When I add the cell references to the data I want the COUNTA function to focus on, I need to leave the headers out. And that's because a COUNTA function will count any kind of data in a cell. That could be useful for other purposes, but in this case, I don't want it to count those headers. I find out that altogether, these volunteers worked 36 shifts on these dates at the animal shelter. Now I'd like to find out how many shifts each volunteer worked. To do this, I use the COUNTIF function. For the cell references, I'll again point to this data. In this case, however, I could include the headers because a COUNTIF function is going to want to look for a particular set of characters, in this case, for example, the last name of the volunteer in question, Altschuler. So it's going to ignore these headers. I'll add that last name into the function in quotes. And I find out that Altschuler worked 4 shifts on these days. In Sheets, just when you thought of an efficient way to do something, you usually can build on it to make a more efficient way of doing something. My first instinct is to drag this formula down. But then I'd have to do a few things. One of which is I'd have to enter in the last name of this volunteer, because this formula is still looking for Altschuler. Also, Google Sheets will update the cell references by moving that range down 1 row, and I don't want it to do that. So going back to my original formula, I can first replace the last name of the volunteer in question with a cell reference, and I have that cell handy right here. It contains the volunteer's last name. Next, I want to change these cell references from relative references to absolute references. And to do that, I add a $sign before each letter and number in the cell reference. That tells Google Sheets that this range of cells referenced in this function should stay the same regardless of where I copy the function. Now when I drag the function down, Google Sheets tells me how many shifts each volunteer worked at the animal shelter. And if I want to do a quick check of my formulas, always a good idea, I simply use the sum function to add together these cells to verify that the answer is the same as the total shifts I got over here using the COUNTA function. So there's some quick ways to make sure your spreadsheets count. By the way, Google Sheets is an online rival to Microsoft's popular Excel spreadsheet app, and the two are remarkably similar. So what you've seen here will also work in Excel too.